They called her poor Aunt Eleanor. Between quiet laughter and looks of contempt, her own family declared that she was a lost cause, a burden no one wanted to carry. But while they planned to send her to a charity shelter, Eleanor was quietly signing the paper that would change the fate of everyone in that room. With her last savings, Eleanor bought what the town called the 4th Street Shame, a ruined structure that even the rats had abandoned. They laughed when they saw her enter that broken house with only a suitcase and her old books. But what no one knew is that Eleanor was not seeing rubble. She was seeing a secret that had been hidden in plain sight for more than a century. What Eleanor discovered under the floor of that ruined house not only turned the shame of the city into a priceless treasure, but gave her the most elegant revenge anyone could imagine. Prepare to know the journey of a woman who was despised by the world, but who proved that gold shines brighter in the shadows. Stories like Eleanor's show us that the true value of a person should never be underestimated. If you like stories of overcoming, justice, and unbelievable discoveries, subscribe to our channel now. By being a part of our community, you guarantee that you will never miss one of these exciting life lessons. Leave your like if you also believe that respect is won with wisdom. And now, let's get back to that cold dinner, where the contempt of Eleanor's family ignited the flame of the biggest twist in her life. October 15th, 2019. The Riverside Restaurant, an upscale establishment in Burlington, Vermont, where Eleanor Morrison's nephew Richard had insisted on hosting a family dinner. Eleanor knew from the moment she received the invitation that this wasn't about family. Richard didn't do anything out of kindness. At 60 years old, after losing her librarian position due to budget cuts and watching her small savings dwindle over 2 years of unemployment, Eleanor had learned to recognize pity masked as concern. She arrived precisely on time, wearing her best dress, which was 10 years old but clean and pressed. Her grey hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She carried herself with the dignity that 40 years of working in the city's main library had instilled in her. Richard was already there, seated at a corner table with his sister Diane. Both were in their 30s, successful, well-dressed, and wearing expressions that Eleanor recognized immediately, the look of people who'd already made a decision about someone else's life. "Aunt Eleanor," Richard stood, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "So glad you could make it." "Of course," Eleanor replied quietly, taking the seat they'd left for her, notably the one with her back to the restaurant facing the wall. A small thing, but telling. They didn't want her visible to other diners. Diane leaned forward with exaggerated concern. "Aunt Eleanor, you look tired. Are you eating enough?" "I'm fine, Diane. Thank you for asking." "Are you, though?" Richard interjected, his voice taking on that particular tone people use when they're about to say something they've rehearsed. "Because we've been talking, Diane and I, and we're worried about you." Eleanor said nothing, just waited. She'd learned long ago that silence often revealed more than questions. "The thing is," Diane continued, glancing at her brother for support, "you're 60 years old now. You've been unemployed for 2 years. Your savings must be almost gone. And we want to help." "Help how?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew. Richard pulled out a brochure and slid it across the table. "Brookside Commons. It's a very affordable senior living facility. Subsidized housing for people on fixed incomes. They have activities, communal meals, everything you'd need." Eleanor looked at the brochure without touching it. The photos showed tired buildings, small rooms, elderly people sitting in wheelchairs in hallways that smelled, even through the glossy paper, of institutional disinfectant and resignation. "A nursing home," she said flatly. "A senior community," Diane corrected quickly, "for people who need support, structure. I'm 60, not 90. I don't need a nursing home." "Aunt Eleanor, be realistic." Richard's voice hardened slightly, showing the impatience he'd been holding back. "You can't afford your apartment anymore. You have no income, no prospects. You were a librarian. It's not like you have transferable skills for the modern job market." The words hit like small, calculated slaps. Eleanor felt her face flush, but she kept her voice steady. "I see. We're not trying to be cruel," Diane said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "We're trying to be practical. You can't keep living on credit cards and denial. Something has to change. We've already contacted Brookside, Richard added. They have an opening. We could have you moved in by the end of the month. You just need to sell your furniture, your books, whatever you have left. Travel light, you know. Start fresh. Eleanor looked at her nephew and niece, the children of her late brother, whom she'd helped raise after their mother left, whom she'd tutored through school, whom she'd lent money to for college that was never repaid. They were looking at her now like she was a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed. "And what about you?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Your father left me a small inheritance, just $15,000, but it's mine. Would that go toward this facility?" Richard and Diane exchanged glances. "Well," Richard said carefully, "Brookside requires residents to contribute what they can toward their care. But honestly, Aunt Eleanor, $15,000 won't last long anywhere. You'd be better off using it for the move and initial costs." "I see," Eleanor repeated. She took a sip of water, her hand perfectly steady despite the rage building in her chest. "So you've planned my entire future. How thoughtful." "Someone had to," Diane said, an edge creeping into her voice. "You clearly weren't going to do it yourself. You're living in denial, Aunt Eleanor. You're 60 years old with no job, no prospects, and no family to take care of you, because you're certainly not offering," Eleanor said quietly. The table fell silent. Richard cleared his throat. "We have our own families, our own responsibilities. We can't take you in. Surely you understand that." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Eleanor said. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "Thank you for dinner, and for making everything so clear." "Aunt Eleanor, sit down," Richard said, his voice low and urgent, aware of other diners glancing over. "We haven't even ordered yet. I've lost my appetite." "You're being ridiculous," Diane hissed. "We're trying to help you." Eleanor looked at her niece, this woman she'd taught to read, whose scraped knees she'd bandaged, whose homework she'd checked, and saw nothing but contempt, thinly veiled as concern. "No," Eleanor said softly. "You're trying to make me disappear. There's a difference." She walked out of the restaurant with her head high and her back straight, but once she reached her car, a 15-year-old sedan held together by prayer and routine maintenance, she allowed herself to cry. They'd called her a burden, a lost cause, someone with no prospects, no value, no future worth preserving. Eleanor sat in her car in the restaurant parking lot, tears streaming down her face, and made a decision. She would never, ever be at the mercy of people who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenient problem again. That night, back in her small apartment, Eleanor pulled out a box she'd been keeping in her closet. Inside were dozens of architectural surveys, historical documents, and property listings she'd been collecting for the past 6 months. Her nephew was right about one thing. Her $15,000 wouldn't last long if she tried to live on it, but it might be enough for something else. Something Richard and Diane in their comfortable smugness would never understand. Eleanor had spent 40 years as a librarian, 40 years of research, of finding connections others missed, of understanding that the most valuable information was often hidden in plain sight, and she had found something extraordinary. On her laptop, she pulled up a property listing she'd been watching for weeks. 847 4th Street, known locally as the 4th Street Shame, a condemned Victorian house that had been on the market for 2 years with no buyers. The asking price had dropped to $12,000. Eleanor looked at the photos of the ruined structure, then at the historical documents spread across her dining table. Architectural plans from 1922, city records showing the house's original owner, library archives about a famous author who'd lived in Burlington in the 1920s. And there, in a notation so small most people would miss it, was what Eleanor had seen, a discrepancy between the house's exterior dimensions and its interior floor plan, a space that shouldn't exist, a room that had been hidden deliberately for nearly a century. Eleanor Morrison had spent her life surrounded by books, by stories, by the accumulated knowledge of generations. She knew that valuable things were often hidden where no one thought to look. She picked up her phone and called the real estate agent. "Yes, this is Eleanor Morrison. I'd like to make an offer on 847 4th Street. The full asking price, cash." There was a pause on the other end. "Mum, are you sure? That property is condemned. It's not livable. The city is considering demolishing it." I'm quite sure, Eleanor said. When can we close? 2 weeks later, on November 1st, 2019, Eleanor Morrison stood in front of the real estate office, signed the final papers, and became the owner of the most notorious property in Burlington, Vermont. The real estate agent looked at her with undisguised pity. I have to tell you, Miss Morrison, I think you're making a terrible mistake, but it's your money. Yes? Eleanor replied calmly. It is. She walked out of that office knowing that Richard and Diane would hear about this, knowing they'd laugh, knowing the whole town would think she'd lost her mind. But Eleanor wasn't concerned with what people thought. She was concerned with what she knew, and what she knew was about to change everything. The first time Eleanor saw her house up close, she understood why people called it the 4th Street Shame. It sat at the end of a row of beautifully maintained Victorian homes, like a diseased tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. Where its neighbours boasted fresh paint, manicured lawns and welcoming porches, 847 4th Street offered only decay. The house was a 3-story Victorian that had probably been stunning in 1922 when it was built. Now, nearly a century later, it was a monument to neglect. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine, missing so many shingles that the bare wood underneath showed through in patches. The porch had partially collapsed on one side, the support beam having rotted through completely. Several windows were broken, others so covered in grime they appeared nearly black. The front door hung crooked on rusted hinges. The white paint that had once covered the wood siding had peeled away in long strips, leaving the grey, weathered boards beneath exposed to the elements. Vines had grown up the walls and were actively pulling the siding away from the frame in several places. The yard was a disaster. What had once been a garden was now a jungle of dead bushes, overgrown weeds that stood waist-high, and a tree that had died and was slowly falling toward the house, caught against the roof. As Eleanor stood on the sidewalk with her single suitcase and 3 boxes of books, a car slowed down. Inside, a middle-aged couple stared at her, then at the house, then back at her. The woman said something to the man, and they both laughed before driving away. Eleanor had seen that look before. It was the same look Richard and Diane had given her at the restaurant. Within hours, the whole neighborhood knew. The crazy old woman had actually bought the shame. People found excuses to walk by, to see if the rumors were true. 2 houses down, Eleanor could hear a man talking loudly to his wife in their front yard. I give her a week, maybe 2 if she's stubborn. Then she'll realize what a mistake she's made, and the city can finally bulldoze that eyesore. His wife laughed. Did you see her? She's got to be at least 60. What's she thinking, buying a condemned house? She probably spent her last dime on it too. More money than sense, the man agreed. Well, it'll be entertaining to watch at least. Eleanor ignored them. She walked up the broken porch steps carefully, testing each board before putting her weight on it. 2 of the steps were completely rotten through. She'd need to replace those immediately, or risk breaking her leg. The front door's lock was broken, but the door itself was so swollen with moisture that she had to use her shoulder to force it open. It gave way with a groan that sounded almost alive. The interior was, if possible, worse than the exterior. The entry hall's hardwood floor was covered in years of accumulated dirt, leaves that had blown in through broken windows, and what looked like animal droppings. The wallpaper, once probably quite beautiful, hung in strips revealing water-stained plaster beneath. The ceiling showed brown circles where water had leaked through for years. The smell was overwhelming. Mold, decay, dampness, and something else Eleanor couldn't quite identify. Probably dead rodents in the walls. She walked slowly through the first floor, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. The parlor, the dining room, what had been a kitchen, but was now just a shell with broken cabinets and a floor that felt dangerously soft in spots. Everywhere she looked, she saw destruction. Pipes that had burst and never been repaired, electrical wiring that hung exposed from holes in the walls, floors that sagged, ceilings that were definitely going to collapse if she didn't do something about them. The staircase to the second floor looked questionable at best. Several steps were cracked, and the banister was missing entirely on one side. Eleanor climbed carefully, testing each step. On the second floor she found 4 bedrooms and a bathroom that was so disgusting She couldn't even bring herself to enter it. Every bedroom had the same story. Water damage, peeling paint, floors covered in debris, windows that let in almost as much air as if they were simply open. The third floor was an attic that had partially collapsed, the roof damage having let in years of rain and snow. As Eleanor stood in what had once been the master bedroom, looking at the devastation around her, she heard laughter from outside. She went to the grimy window and saw a group of teenagers had gathered on the sidewalk. They were pointing at the house and laughing, taking photos with their phones. One of them yelled loud enough for Eleanor to hear, "Hey lady, the haunted house tour is next month. You're early." His friends erupted in laughter. Eleanor watched them for a moment, then turned away from the window. Let them laugh. Let everyone laugh. She knew something they didn't. That evening, as the sun set and Eleanor sat on the one patch of porch that seemed solid enough to support her weight, her phone rang. Richard. She considered not answering, but curiosity won out. "Aunt Eleanor?" His voice dripped with false concern. "I heard about your purchase. I wanted to call and make sure you're okay." "I'm fine, Richard. You spent your entire inheritance on a condemned house." He wasn't even pretending concern anymore. "Diane and we knew you weren't thinking clearly, but this is beyond anything we imagined. You've essentially made yourself homeless." "I have a house," Eleanor replied calmly. "You have a death trap. Aunt Eleanor, that building should be demolished. Everyone in town is talking about it. You're making yourself a laughingstock. Is there a reason you called, Richard?" He sighed heavily, the sound of a man dealing with a difficult child. "Look, it's not too late. You can still sell. You'll take a loss, obviously. No one will pay what you paid for that wreck, but you'll have something. Enough to get into Brookside and maybe have a little left over." "I'm not selling." "Then what exactly is your plan? You can't live there. You have no money left for repairs. You have no income. What are you going to do?" Eleanor looked at the ruined house behind her, seeing not what it was, but what it had been, what it could be again. "I'm going to fix it," she said simply. Richard laughed. Actually laughed. "You? Fix it? Aunt Eleanor, you're 60 years old. You're a librarian, not a contractor. That house needs tens of thousands of dollars in repairs, maybe hundreds of thousands, and you have nothing." "I have time," Eleanor replied, "and I have knowledge. That's more than you think." "This is insane," Richard said, his voice hardening. "You're being stubborn and foolish, and when this falls apart, and it will fall apart, don't come crying to us for help. Diane and I are done. We tried to help you and you threw it in our faces. You're on your own." "Richard," Eleanor said quietly, "I was always on my own. I just didn't realize it until you made it clear at that dinner. So thank you, actually. You did me a favor." She hung up before he could respond. That night, Eleanor slept in the least damaged bedroom on the second floor, on an air mattress she'd bought with her last $20. She had no electricity, so she used a battery-powered lantern. She had no water, so she'd filled jugs from a gas station. She had no heat, and November in Vermont was cold, but she had her house, and she had her secret. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the old house creak and settle around her, Eleanor pulled out the architectural plans she'd carried with her. She traced the lines with her finger, measuring the spaces that didn't quite add up. Somewhere in this house was a room that wasn't on any modern floor plan, a room that had been deliberately hidden nearly a century ago, and Eleanor was going to find it. The first month was the hardest. Eleanor woke each morning at dawn, not by choice, but because the cold drove her from sleep. November in Vermont wasn't forgiving, and the house had no heat. She'd bought the warmest sleeping bag she could afford, but it barely kept the chill at bay. She couldn't afford contractors. She couldn't even afford basic power tools. What she had was time, determination, and a library card that gave her access to every home repair manual ever written. So Eleanor started small. She began with the porch, because without safe access to the house, everything else was pointless. She bought used lumber from a salvage yard, borrowing a neighbor's saw and promising to return it the same day. She spent 3 days replacing the rotten steps, learning through trial and error how to measure, cut, and secure the boards. Her hands, soft from decades of handling books, developed blisters that turned into calluses. Her back ached from physical labor her body wasn't accustomed to. Her knees protested every time she knelt to work, but there was something profoundly satisfying about the work, something honest. When Eleanor sanded a piece of wood, she could hear the rough paper against the grain, a rhythmic whisper that became almost meditative. When she washed the filthy windows with homemade solution, vinegar and water, because she couldn't afford commercial cleaners, she could smell the sharp tang cutting through the accumulated grime. The windows were a revelation. As she cleaned each one, scrubbing away years of dirt, it was like the house was opening its eyes. Light flooded into rooms that had been dim for decades, and as the windows became clear, Eleanor found herself seeing the world outside more clearly too. The anger she'd felt toward Richard and Diane began to fade, not into forgiveness but into something more useful, indifference. They'd shown her who they were. That knowledge was enough. She didn't need to waste energy on resentment. The neighbors continued to watch, but their mockery began to shift into something else as weeks passed, and Eleanor didn't give up. Curiosity, maybe, or grudging respect. One morning, Eleanor was on the porch, struggling to remove a section of rotted wood, when a voice called out, "You're doing that wrong." She looked up to find an elderly man standing at the edge of her property. He was probably in his 70s, wearing work clothes and a suspicious expression. "Excuse me?" Eleanor replied. "The wood. You're trying to pry it off, but you need to cut the nails first, or you'll break the good boards." He walked closer, uninvited. "I'm Frank. I live 3 houses down. I've been watching you work." "I'm sure you have," Eleanor said dryly. "Half the neighborhood has." Frank had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Yeah, well, we all thought you were crazy. Some still do, but I've been watching you actually work on this place, and I figure anyone stubborn enough to try deserves at least some advice so you don't kill yourself." He showed her how to cut the nails, how to remove damaged boards without destroying the good ones, how to identify which wood could be saved and which had to go. "You know anything about electricity?" he asked after an hour of helping her. "I know it can kill me if I'm not careful," Eleanor replied. Frank snorted. "Good. That's more than most people know. The wiring in this house is probably from the 30s. It'll all need to be replaced before you can get power turned on safely. You got money for an electrician?" "No, didn't think so." He studied her for a moment. "I used to be an electrician before I retired. I could teach you the basics. Not the licensed stuff. You'll need to have that inspected properly, but enough to be safe." "Why would you help me?" Eleanor asked. Frank shrugged. "Because you remind me of my late wife. Stubborn as hell and too proud to quit even when everyone told her she should. Also, I'm bored. Retirement is boring." He gestured at the house. "This is at least interesting." Over the next weeks, Frank became a regular presence. He taught Eleanor about electrical systems, about plumbing, about the structural integrity of old houses. He didn't do the work for her, but he showed her how to do it safely. Other neighbors began to contribute in small ways. Someone left a box of tools on her porch anonymously. Someone else dropped off bags of salvaged materials from their own renovation. A woman named Carol started bringing Eleanor sandwiches at lunch, claiming she always made too much food. "The betting pool about how long you'd last is up to 3 months now," Carol mentioned one day. "I put money on you still being here at Christmas." "Just 3 months?" Eleanor asked. "Hey, that's up from 1 week. You're making progress." Christmas came and went. Eleanor spent it alone in her house, but she had electricity now in 3 rooms. She'd repaired the bathroom enough to be functional. She'd replaced the worst of the broken windows with salvaged ones that didn't quite match, but kept the cold out. The house was still a wreck, but it was becoming her wreck. Every evening, after working until exhaustion forced her to stop, Eleanor would sit in what had been the parlor, now clean but empty, and read by lamplight. She'd brought her favorite books with her, the ones that had survived her downsizing. Classic novels, poetry, histories. And late at night, when the house was quiet except for its old house sounds, Eleanor would take out the architectural plans and study them. She'd cleared most of the first floor now. She'd stabilized the second floor enough to be safe. The third floor attic remained dangerous, but she'd secured the roof enough to stop further water damage, which meant it was almost time to find what she'd come here for. The architectural plans showed a parlor that was 18 feet by 14 feet, but when Eleanor measured the actual parlor, it was only 16 feet by 14 feet. 2 feet were missing, hidden behind the walls. In February, 4 months after moving in, Eleanor began carefully examining the parlor walls. She tapped along the plaster, listening for hollow sounds. She studied the molding, looking for seams that didn't match. And there, along the west wall, she found it. A section of wall that sounded different when tapped. A place where the molding didn't quite line up correctly. But to access whatever was behind it, she'd need to remove the large brick fireplace that dominated that wall. A fireplace that had clearly been added long after the house was built. The bricks were from the 1970s. Totally wrong for the 1920s architecture of the rest of the house. Someone had built a fireplace to hide something. And Eleanor was about to find out what. The fireplace was ugly. That was Eleanor's first thought when she'd started cleaning the parlor months ago. It was a blocky 1970s monstrosity of orange brick with a metal insert, completely out of place in a 1920s Victorian. It had never worked. The flue was blocked and the whole thing was just decorative dead weight taking up space. But removing it was a massive undertaking for one 60-year-old woman with no experience in demolition. Eleanor started on a Monday morning in late February. She'd spent the weekend reading everything she could find about safely removing brick fireplaces. She'd borrowed Frank's heavy sledgehammer and wore every piece of protective equipment she could afford. Safety glasses, work gloves, a dust mask. The first swing sent a shock up her arms that made her teeth rattle. The brick cracked but didn't break. The second swing achieved similar results. By the 10th swing, Eleanor was sweating despite the cold, her muscles screaming in protest. It took her 3 days to break down the outer layer of brick. Each piece had to be carefully removed and carried out of the house. Hundreds of bricks, each trip making her back ache more. On the 4th day, as she pulled away a section of brick from the interior structure, something changed. Instead of the wall studs and insulation she expected to find behind the false fireplace, her sledgehammer hit something different. Stone. Eleanor stopped, her heart suddenly racing. She carefully cleared away more brick, shining her work light into the gap she'd created. There, behind the ugly 1970s facade, was something entirely different. A fireplace made of white marble, intricate and beautiful, carved with Art Deco designs that were unmistakably from the 1920s. "Oh," Eleanor breathed. "Oh my God!" She worked with renewed energy, carefully removing the rest of the brick facade. As more of the original fireplace was revealed, Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. It was stunning, white marble with grey veining, carved with geometric patterns and stylized flowers. The mantel was supported by columns with capitals decorated in acanthus leaves. Above the firebox, carved into the marble, was a name, Whitmore House, 1922. Whitmore, the name Eleanor had found in her research. Jonathan Whitmore, the author. But that wasn't all. As Eleanor cleared away the last of the 1970s brick, she noticed something odd. The marble fireplace, beautiful as it was, sat slightly forward from the wall, maybe 3 inches. When she put her hand against the wall beside the fireplace, she felt a draft. Cold air was coming from somewhere. Eleanor examined the side of the fireplace more carefully. The marble extended into the wall, but there was a vertical seam barely visible that ran from floor to ceiling. Her hands shaking, Eleanor pressed along the seam. About 4 feet up, she felt something give, a slight depression in the marble that clicked when pressed. A hidden latch. With a soft grinding sound, a section of the wall beside the fireplace swung inward, revealing darkness beyond. Eleanor stood frozen for a long moment, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Then she grabbed her flashlight and stepped through the opening. The room beyond was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet with a low ceiling. The air smelled musty but not moldy. The space had been sealed, preserved. Her flashlight beam swept across the space and Eleanor gasped. Books. The room was filled with books. Built-in shelves lined 3 walls from floor to ceiling, and every shelf was packed with leather-bound volumes. In the center of the room stood a small desk with a chair, and on the desk sat a typewriter, an old manual machine that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Eleanor stepped closer, her hands trembling as she reached for the nearest book. She pulled it carefully from the shelf and opened it to the title page. In faded but still legible handwriting it read, The Midnight Garden, Jonathan Whitmore, 1924, original manuscript. Eleanor's breath caught. She pulled another book. Songs of the Lost, Jonathan Whitmore, 1926, original manuscript. Another. The House of Whispers, Jonathan Whitmore, 1928, original manuscript. There were dozens of them, maybe 100, all original manuscripts, handwritten or typed by Jonathan Whitmore. Eleanor knew the name because she was a librarian. Jonathan Whitmore had been a moderately successful author in the 1920s, known for his lyrical prose and dark, atmospheric novels. He'd published 5 books between 1922 and 1930, then disappeared from public life. He died in 1935, and after his death, scholars had noted that he must have written more. References in letters, mentions of works in progress, but none had ever been found, until now. Eleanor pulled out the desk chair and sat down carefully, afraid it might collapse after decades of disuse. On the desk, beside the typewriter, was a leather journal. She opened it to the first page. February 3rd, 1931. I have sealed the room today. Everything I've written, everything I couldn't bring myself to publish, it's all here now, hidden behind the marble I brought from Italy, concealed behind a wall that will someday, I hope, crumble. When this house finally falls, when time does what I cannot, perhaps someone will find these words. Perhaps they will understand what I tried to do. The published works were compromises. The editors wanted romance, wanted happy endings, wanted lies. These manuscripts, my real work, tell the truth. They're too dark, too honest, too much a mirror of the world I see. No one wants to read them now, but someday, perhaps, someone will. I leave them here as a gift to the future, to whoever has the courage to look beneath the surface of things. Eleanor read the entire journal entry, then another, then another. Whitmore had spent his final years living as a recluse in this house, writing constantly, but publishing nothing. He'd hidden this room and its contents deliberately, sealing it behind marble and brick, preserving it for whoever might someday discover it. Eleanor stood and began carefully examining the manuscripts. Some were handwritten in careful script. Some were typed on yellowed paper. Some had notes in the margins, revisions, crossed-out sections. They were beautiful. Dark, yes. Whitmore had written about loss, about death, about the shadows that lurked in ordinary life. But they were brilliant, filled with the kind of prose that made Eleanor want to read passages aloud, just to hear how the words sounded. These weren't just manuscripts. They were a literary treasure that had been lost for 90 years. Eleanor found herself laughing and crying at the same time, sitting alone in a hidden room in a house everyone had called worthless, surrounded by priceless words. She'd been right, the space that wasn't on the floor plans. The architectural inconsistency she'd noticed. It had all been real, and now she owned it, all of it. Eleanor carefully closed the manuscripts and returned them to their shelves. She'd need to handle this carefully. These needed to be preserved, authenticated, studied by experts. But they were hers. The house was hers. The manuscripts were hers. She thought of Richard and Diane, of the restaurant where they'd called her a burden with no prospects. She thought of the neighbors who'd laughed when she moved in. She thought of everyone who'd assumed that a 60-year-old unemployed librarian had nothing to offer the world. Eleanor Morrison sat in Jonathan Whitmore's hidden library, surrounded by lost literary treasures, and allowed herself to smile. "Thank you," she whispered to the long-dead author. "Thank you for hiding this where only someone who really looked would find it." Then she stood, turned off her flashlight, and carefully closed the secret door. She had work to do. Eleanor didn't rush. That was the key. She knew that if she handled this wrong, if she appeared too eager or uninformed, she could be taken advantage of. So she did what she'd always done best: research. She spent 2 weeks carefully cataloguing every manuscript in the hidden library. She photographed each title page, each dedication, each revision note. She created a detailed inventory with descriptions and conditions. She worked wearing cotton gloves she'd ordered online, handling each page as gently as she would a newborn. There were 73 complete manuscripts total. Some were novels, some were collections of short stories, some were poetry. All were in Whitmore's hand with his signature on the title pages. Eleanor also found correspondence. Letters between Whitmore and various publishers, letters from fellow authors, personal letters that provided context for his life and work. There were photographs. Whitmore at his desk, Whitmore with other literary figures of the 1920s, Whitmore standing in front of this very house. Each piece added to the provenance, the proof that this collection was authentic and significant. Only when Eleanor had documented everything thoroughly did she begin reaching out to experts. Her first contact was Professor Margaret Chen at the University of Vermont, who specialized in American literature of the 1920s and 30s. Eleanor sent a carefully worded email attaching photos of 3 manuscripts and asking if Professor Chen would be willing to examine some items of potential literary interest. Professor Chen's response came within hours. "Where did you find these? If they're authentic, this is extraordinary. When can I see them?" They met at the house 3 days later. Professor Chen arrived with another scholar, Dr. Robert Morrison from Columbia University, who happened to be visiting. Both wore expressions of professional skepticism. They'd probably seen their share of supposed discoveries that turned out to be nothing. That skepticism lasted approximately 30 seconds. Eleanor led them to the hidden library. She'd left the secret door open for their visit and watched their faces as they stepped inside. "Dear God," Professor Chen whispered. "It's really real." For the next 4 hours, the scholars examined the manuscripts with increasing excitement. They verified Whitmore's handwriting against known examples. They examined the paper, the ink, the typewriter keys. They read passages aloud to each other, marveling at the quality of the prose. "These are better than his published works," Dr. Morrison said, shaking his head in wonder. "These are what he really wanted to write. They're darker, more experimental, more honest. This is going to change how we understand Whitmore's entire career." "How did you find this?" Professor Chen asked Eleanor. "This house has been here for a century. How did no one discover this before?" Eleanor showed them the architectural plans, explained the discrepancy she'd noticed, described the 1970s fireplace that had concealed the original marble. "Someone in the 70s bought the house and either didn't know about the room or deliberately covered it up," Eleanor explained. "Then the house fell into disrepair and was eventually abandoned. By the time I bought it, everyone assumed it was just a worthless ruin." "But you saw something they didn't," Professor Chen said, looking at Eleanor with open admiration. "You did the research. You found the clue." "I'm a librarian," Eleanor replied simply. "Research is what I do." Over the next weeks, more experts came. Conservation specialists from major museums, rare book dealers, literary scholars. Each confirmed what Eleanor already knew. This was a major discovery. The Whitmore manuscripts were not just historically significant, they were valuable. But Eleanor wasn't interested in simply selling them to the highest bidder. That felt wrong, like betraying Whitmore's trust somehow. Instead, she worked with Professor Chen and several museum curators to develop a different plan. The house would become a literary museum and research center. The manuscripts would be preserved in climate-controlled conditions in the hidden library where Whitmore had left them. Scholars could apply to access the collection for research. The house itself would be restored to its 1920s glory, becoming part of the story. And Eleanor would serve as the curator, receiving a salary and living quarters in the house for the rest of her life. Funding came from multiple sources: grants from literary foundations, donations from Whitmore enthusiasts, support from the State Historical Society. The house was designated as a historic landmark, which brought additional preservation funding. By May 2020, just 6 months after Eleanor had bought the worthless house, she had committed funding totaling $800,000 for restoration and preservation, plus an endowment that would provide her a modest but comfortable salary for life. The contracts were signed on a Tuesday morning in the office of the Vermont Historical Preservation Society. When Eleanor walked out, she was no longer a broke, unemployed librarian living in a ruin. She was the curator of the Whitmore House Literary Museum, guardian of one of the most significant literary discoveries in decades, and the resident of a soon-to-be beautifully restored historic home. That evening, Eleanor sat on her newly repaired porch. Frank had helped her build it properly this time, and allowed herself to feel what she'd been suppressing for months. Triumph. She'd been right. She'd bet everything on her research, on her instincts, on her belief that valuable things are often hidden where no one thinks to look. And she'd won. Carol came by with dinner. She'd made a habit of checking on Eleanor regularly. "I heard the news," she said, grinning. "The whole neighborhood is talking about it. You know what they're saying now?" "What?" Eleanor asked. "They're saying you're a genius, that you saw what no one else could see, that you turned garbage into gold." "I didn't turn garbage into gold," Eleanor corrected gently. "I recognized gold that everyone else mistook for garbage. There's a difference." Carol laughed. "You're going to have to tell me how you figured it out. The architectural plans, the research, all of it." "I spent 40 years as a librarian," Eleanor replied. "I know how to find information. I know how to see patterns. And I know that the most valuable discoveries are usually the ones that require actual effort to make." She looked at her house. Still a mess, still needing months of work, but no longer a shame, no longer worthless. "Everyone assumed this house was garbage because it looked like garbage," Eleanor said. "They didn't look deeper. They didn't question. They just accepted the surface appearance as the whole truth." She smiled. "People make that mistake about houses. They make it about people too." The restoration took 8 months. Eleanor insisted on being involved in every decision. This wasn't just about making the house pretty. It was about honoring what it had been, what Whitmore had intended it to be. The restoration team started with the structure: foundation, roof, walls. They replaced rotted wood with carefully matched period-appropriate materials. They repaired the failing systems, electrical, plumbing, heating, while hiding the modern updates behind original surfaces. The exterior was restored to its 1920s glory. The porch was rebuilt exactly as the original plans showed. The siding was replaced where necessary, and painted a historically accurate cream color with forest green trim. The decorative woodwork, gingerbread details that had rotted away, was recreated by skilled craftspeople. The garden was researched and replanted with species that would have been popular in 1922. The dead tree that had been falling toward the house was safely removed. The jungle of weeds became a period-appropriate English garden with roses, lilacs, and flowering perennials. Inside, the transformation was even more dramatic. The hardwood floors, once buried under layers of grime, were sanded and refinished to a warm honey glow. The plaster walls were repaired and painted in colors taken from original paint chips found during demolition. Soft greens, warm creams, deep burgundy. The marble fireplace, once hidden, became the centerpiece of the parlor. Cleaned and restored, it gleamed white with elegant gray veining. The carved details, the Art Deco flowers, the geometric patterns, the Whitmore House inscription were now clearly visible. The hidden library was equipped with climate control, archival quality shelving and security systems, all installed without disturbing the room's original character. The manuscripts remained where Whitmore had left them, but now they were properly preserved and protected. Throughout the house, historical photographs of Whitmore and his contemporaries were displayed. Original furniture from the 1920s was acquired to furnish the rooms authentically. In the dining room, a collection of Whitmore's published works was displayed, alongside editions in multiple languages. Eleanor's private quarters were on the second floor: a bedroom, a small sitting room, a private bathroom. Comfortable but modest. She didn't need luxury. She needed security, peace, and the satisfaction of living in a place she'd saved. The official opening of the Whitmore House Literary Museum was scheduled for February 2021, exactly 1 year after Eleanor had discovered the hidden library. But before that, in November 2020, just over a year after Eleanor had moved in, the local paper ran a feature story, "The Woman Who Saved the 4th Street Shame." The article told Eleanor's story, the unemployed librarian who'd spent her last savings on a condemned house, the architectural research that led to the discovery, the hidden library filled with lost manuscripts, the transformation of the town's greatest eyesore into its most valuable cultural asset. The article included before and after photos. The difference was staggering. Before, a collapsing ruin with broken windows, sagging roof, dead garden, and an overall aura of abandonment and decay. After, a stunning Victorian mansion, cream and green with intricate woodwork, welcoming porch, blooming gardens, and an elegant presence that made neighboring houses look plain by comparison. The article went viral. National news picked it up. Literary journals wrote about the Whitmore discovery. Architecture magazines featured the restoration. Eleanor Morrison, who'd been called Poor Aunt Eleanor by her own family, became a minor celebrity. She was interviewed by NPR, featured in the New York Times, invited to speak at library conferences and historical societies. The property that neighbors had hoped would be demolished became the most photographed house in Burlington. Tour buses began including it in their routes. Property values on 4th Street increased because of its presence. The neighbors who'd mocked Eleanor now bragged about living near her. Carol, who'd been one of Eleanor's few supporters from the beginning, came by on the day of the newspaper article. "I won the betting pool," she announced, grinning. "I was the only one who bet you'd still be here after a year. Everyone else thought you'd give up." "What did you win?" Eleanor asked. $50. "But more importantly, I won the satisfaction of being right." She looked at the restored house with open admiration. "You've done something amazing here, Eleanor. You've made something beautiful out of something everyone else had given up on." Eleanor smiled. "The beauty was always here. It was just hidden. I just had the patience to find it." That night, Eleanor sat in the restored parlor, in a comfortable chair by the marble fireplace, reading one of Whitmore's unpublished manuscripts. The house was warm, well lit, peaceful. Outside, she could hear voices, people walking by, stopping to admire the house, taking photos. She'd become accustomed to it. The house that had once been avoided was now a destination. Eleanor looked around the room at the restored woodwork, the gleaming floors, the elegant furniture, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the house's monetary value or her newfound minor fame. She'd proven something important, not just to others but to herself, that at 60 years old, unemployed, and written off by her own family, she still had value. She still had skills. She still had the ability to accomplish remarkable things. The restoration of the house had been, in many ways, the restoration of herself. As she cleaned the grime from the windows, she'd begun to see the world more clearly. As she repaired each broken part of the house, she'd repaired broken parts of herself. As she revealed the beauty hidden beneath years of neglect, she'd revealed her own worth that others had failed to see. Eleanor Morrison wasn't just the curator of the Whitmore house. She was living proof that valuable things, houses, manuscripts, people, are often overlooked simply because they don't shine brightly enough for those who only look at surfaces. But for those willing to look deeper, the treasures are there, waiting to be discovered. They came on a Saturday afternoon in December 2020, 2 months before the museum's official opening. Eleanor was in the garden, supervising the installation of a bronze plaque that would tell visitors about the house's history. She heard a car pull up and turned to see a familiar luxury sedan parking at the curb, Richard and Diane. Eleanor hadn't spoken to either of them since the night Richard had called to mock her purchase of the house. That had been over a year ago. She'd heard through mutual acquaintances that they'd seen the news coverage. She'd known this visit was coming eventually. She just hadn't expected them to look quite so uncomfortable. Richard got out first, wearing an expensive coat and a smile that looked rehearsed. Diane followed, her expression a careful mask of warmth that didn't reach her eyes. "Aunt Eleanor?" Richard called out, as if they were close relatives delighted to see each other. "Look at this place, it's absolutely stunning. We were just driving by and couldn't believe the transformation." Eleanor set down the gardening gloves she'd been holding and walked toward them, taking her time. Let them wait. "Richard, Diane," she said evenly. "What a surprise." "We've been meaning to come by," Diane gushed. "We saw the article in the Times, and of course all the news coverage. We're so proud of you. We always knew you had it in you." The lie was so blatant that Eleanor almost laughed, but she kept her expression neutral. "Did you?" she asked. "Because I distinctly remember you calling me a lost cause, a burden, someone with no prospects who needed to be put in subsidized housing." The smiles faltered. Richard cleared his throat. "Aunt Eleanor, we were concerned about you. Maybe we expressed it poorly, but our hearts were in the right place." "Were they?" Eleanor asked. "Or were you simply trying to get rid of an inconvenient relative?" "That's not fair," Diane protested. though her voice lacked conviction. Eleanor gestured toward the house. "Would you like to see inside? Since you're here." She could see the eagerness in their eyes. Of course they wanted to see inside. They wanted to see what she'd accomplished, what they'd thought was impossible. Eleanor led them up the restored porch, no longer broken, now elegant and welcoming, and through the front door into the entry hall. She watched their faces as they took in the gleaming floors, the restored woodwork, the subtle lighting that highlighted the architectural details. "This is incredible," Richard breathed. "I can't believe this is the same house." "It is the same house," Eleanor corrected. "It just took someone willing to see its potential." She led them through the parlor, showed them the marble fireplace, explained the hidden library without taking them inside. That was for museum visitors and researchers, not for family who'd abandoned her. They asked questions about the restoration, about the manuscripts, about the museum plans. Eleanor answered politely but without warmth. She was courteous, professional, distant. Finally, standing in the elegant dining room, where afternoon light streamed through restored stained glass windows, Richard got to the real reason for their visit. "Aunt Eleanor, we've been thinking, this house is quite large. You're living here alone. We thought perhaps—" He glanced at Diane for support. "Perhaps we could help you. Maybe stay in one of the upper floor rooms, keep you company, help manage the museum." "Help manage," Eleanor repeated. "Well, this is a big responsibility," Diane added quickly. "You're 61 now, that's a lot to handle alone. We could share the burden. We're family after all." There it was, the word that had haunted Eleanor since that dinner. Burden. Eleanor walked to the sideboard, where she'd prepared tea service. She'd known they'd come eventually. She poured 3 cups with steady hands, added sugar and cream with practiced elegance, and carried them to the table. "Please, sit," she said. They sat, looking hopeful. Eleanor served the tea with the grace of a woman who'd spent a lifetime in the ordered world of libraries and literature. "This is lovely," Diane said, sipping her tea. "You've really turned things around, Aunt Eleanor. We're so happy for you." "Are you?" Eleanor asked. She set down her cup and looked at both of them directly. "Let me tell you what I think is happening here. You heard that the house you mocked me for buying is now worth over $1 million. You heard that I have a stable income for life as curator. You heard that I have security, respect, and a position in this community." She paused. "And you want part of it." "That's not—" Richard started. "Please," Eleanor interrupted gently but firmly. "Let's not insult each other with lies. You didn't come here because you're proud of me. You came because you see an opportunity." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Diane looked at her lap. Richard's jaw tightened. "When I was unemployed and desperate," Eleanor continued, "you wanted to send me to a subsidized nursing home. You called me a burden. You suggested I sell everything I owned because it had no value. You laughed when I bought this house." "I called to check on you," Richard protested. "You called to tell me I'd made myself a laughingstock," Eleanor corrected. "You told me not to come to you for help when everything fell apart. You said you were done with me." She took a sip of tea. "So I'm simply holding you to your word, Richard. You are done with me, and I'm done with you." "But we're family," Diane said, her voice taking on a whining edge. "No," Eleanor said quietly. "Family doesn't abandon each other. Family doesn't call each other burdens. Family doesn't laugh at each other's struggles." She stood up, indicating the visit was over. "You're welcome to tour the museum when it opens in February. The admission price is $15. But you're not welcome to live here. You're not welcome to help manage anything. This house was saved by my work, my research, my refusal to quit, when everyone, including you, expected me to fail. You're being vindictive," Richard said, standing abruptly. "We're your only family." "That's your choice, not mine," Eleanor replied. "I offered you my trust, and you threw it away. You don't get it back just because my circumstances changed." "So that's it?" Diane demanded. "You're just going to shut us out?" "I'm not shutting you out," Eleanor said calmly. "You shut yourselves out a long time ago. I'm simply declining to let you back in now that it's convenient for you." She walked to the front door and opened it. "I hold no anger toward either of you. I hope you have good lives. But those lives won't intersect with mine anymore. Goodbye." Richard looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Eleanor's expression stopped him. Maybe he recognized that she'd found something he'd never had, genuine dignity that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. They left without another word. Eleanor closed the door behind them and leaned against it for a moment, letting out a long breath. She'd wondered if that confrontation would feel satisfying. It hadn't particularly, but it had felt necessary, final. Frank appeared from the kitchen, where he'd been diplomatically staying out of sight. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," Eleanor said, and meant it. "They're gone, they won't be back." "Good," Frank said gruffly. "Never liked them anyway. Too much cologne and not enough character." Eleanor laughed and returned to the parlor to finish her work for the day. That evening, as she sat by the fireplace reading, she thought about Richard's words. "We're your only family." He was wrong. Frank was more family than Richard had ever been. Carol was family. Professor Chen and the other scholars who genuinely appreciated what she'd discovered were family. The community of librarians and researchers and literary enthusiasts who'd embraced her work were family. Family wasn't about blood. It was about who stayed when things were hard, who celebrated your successes without jealousy, who saw your value even when others didn't. Eleanor had lost the family she was born into, but she'd gained something better, a family she'd chosen and who'd chosen her in return, and that, she realized, was worth more than any number of uncomfortable relatives showing up when it was convenient for them. The Whitmore House Literary Museum opened to the public on February 15, 2021, exactly 1 year after Eleanor had discovered the hidden library. The opening ceremony was attended by over 200 people, scholars, journalists, local officials, members of literary societies, and simply people who loved books and good stories. They gathered in the restored parlor, spilling out into the entry hall and dining room, filling the house with life and warmth. The mayor of Burlington gave a speech about historical preservation and cultural heritage. Professor Chen spoke about the significance of the Whitmore manuscripts for American literature. The director of the Vermont Historical Society talked about the importance of protecting the past for future generations. But the speech everyone remembered was Eleanor's. She stood by the marble fireplace, the fireplace that had hidden the secret for decades, and spoke not from notes, but from her heart. "When I bought this house," she began, "everyone thought I was making a terrible mistake. The house was condemned. The neighborhood called it a shame. My own family said I was throwing my life away on garbage." She smiled. "But I'm a librarian. I've spent my life learning that the most valuable things are often the ones that require effort to understand. The best books aren't always the ones with pretty covers. The most important information isn't always the most obvious." She gestured at the room around them. "This house taught me something important. It taught me that appearances can be deceiving, that what looks like worthless ruins might be hiding priceless treasures, that patient research and careful observation can reveal truths that casual glances miss. But more than that," Eleanor continued, her voice strengthening, "this house taught me about my own value. When I was unemployed at 60, when my family called me a burden, when people laughed at my choices, I had to decide what I believed about myself. Did I believe what they said about me? Or did I believe that I still had something valuable to offer?" She paused, looking around at the filled room. "I chose to believe in myself. I chose to trust my research, my instincts, my abilities, and that choice changed everything. The restoration of this house was in many ways the restoration of my own soul. As I cleaned the windows, I began to see the world more clearly. As I repaired what was broken, I repaired something broken in myself. As I uncovered the beauty hidden beneath years of neglect, I uncovered my own worth that others had failed to see." Eleanor smiled at the audience. Jonathan Whitmore hid his greatest works in a room that couldn't be found without careful search. He trusted that someday someone who really looked would discover them, and he was right. I think there's a lesson in that for all of us. The most valuable things, whether they're manuscripts or houses or people, are often overlooked because they don't shine brightly on the surface. But for those willing to look deeper, to do the research, to have patience, the treasures are there. So this museum is dedicated not just to preserving Whitmore's literary legacy, but to celebrating the idea that gold shines brightest in the shadows, that what seems worthless might be priceless, that it's never too late to discover or to become something remarkable. The applause was thunderous. After the ceremony, people toured the house for hours. They admired the restoration, marveled at the marble fireplace, and stood in reverent silence in the hidden library where the manuscripts were displayed behind protective glass. Many stopped to speak with Eleanor, to thank her for saving the house and sharing the discovery. Some shared their own stories of being underestimated, of fighting to prove their worth, of finding value where others saw none. One woman, probably in her 50s, waited until the crowd thinned to approach Eleanor. "I lost my job last year," she said quietly. "I'm 53 and everyone keeps telling me I'm too old, that no one wants to hire someone my age. I've been feeling worthless, but hearing your story, it gives me hope." Eleanor took the woman's hands. "You're not too old. You're experienced. You have knowledge and skills that younger people haven't had time to develop. The question isn't whether you have value. You do. The question is whether you believe in that value enough to keep fighting for it." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. I needed to hear that." As the day wore on and the last visitors left, Eleanor found herself alone in the parlor as the sun set, painting the room in golden light. Frank appeared in the doorway. "Hell of a day," he said. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "Hell of a day." "You did good, Eleanor, really good. You took something everyone had given up on and made it matter again." "I just saw what was there," Eleanor replied. "Everyone else looked at the surface and stopped. I kept looking." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at 4th Street, no longer the location of the neighborhood shame, but now a point of pride. Tour buses would start coming next week. School groups had already scheduled visits. The museum had applications from researchers wanting to study the Whitmore manuscripts. "You know what's funny?" Eleanor said. "A year ago I was sitting in my tiny apartment, unemployed and alone, thinking my life was essentially over. My family didn't want me, my career was finished. I had nothing but $15,000 and a library card." She smiled. "Now I'm the curator of a literary museum. I have a beautiful home. I have meaningful work. I have genuine friends and a community that values what I do. My life didn't end at 60. It transformed." "Because you were brave enough to bet on yourself," Frank said. "Because I was desperate enough to have no other choice," Eleanor corrected. "But yes, I bet on myself, and for once I won." That night, after everyone had gone, Eleanor sat in her favorite chair in the hidden library, her library now. She'd brought in a comfortable reading chair and a small table with a lamp. This was her private space, where she came to think and read and simply be. She pulled one of Whitmore's manuscripts from the shelf. She'd read them all by now, some multiple times, and opened to a passage she particularly loved. "The world sees surfaces and calls it sight, but true vision requires looking beneath, beyond, between. The gold that glitters in plain view is rarely the most valuable gold. It's the gold hidden in shadows, overlooked by hurried eyes, that holds the deepest worth. And those who find it, those patient seekers who refuse to accept surfaces as truth, they understand that the greatest treasures are always hidden in places everyone else was too busy to search." Eleanor closed the book and smiled. She'd been called poor Aunt Eleanor, a lost cause, a burden, a foolish old woman who'd wasted her last money on garbage. But she'd known something they didn't, that the house wasn't garbage, that she wasn't worthless, that age and unemployment didn't define value. That careful research and patient work could uncover treasures everyone else had missed. She'd proven that a 60-year-old librarian could save a condemned house and discover a lost literary legacy. She'd proven that gold shines brightest in the shadows. She'd proven that the true value of a person, like the true value of a house, lies not in surface appearances, but in what's hidden beneath. Eleanor Morrison, once despised and dismissed, now sat in a hidden library in a restored mansion, curator of priceless manuscripts, living proof that it's never too late to discover your own worth. And that, she thought, was the best revenge of all. Not hurting those who'd hurt her, but proving them so completely wrong that their opinions became irrelevant. She stood, turned off the lamp, and closed the hidden door behind her. Tomorrow, the museum would open again. Visitors would come. Research would continue. The work would go on. But tonight Eleanor Morrison, once called poor, now anything but, would sleep peacefully in the house she'd saved, in the life she'd rebuilt, surrounded by beauty she'd uncovered and value she'd always possessed. The gold had been there all along, hidden in shadows. She'd just been brave enough to keep looking until she found it. If Eleanor's story moved you, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We share powerful true stories every week about overcoming, justice, and unbelievable discoveries. Stories that prove it's never too late to transform your life. Leave a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you discovered value where others saw nothing? Has anyone called you too old or past your prime? Share your story. Your experience might inspire someone who needs to hear it today. Eleanor Morrison's journey teaches us profound truths about value, worth, and potential. She teaches us that age doesn't define capability. At 60, unemployed and dismissed by her own family, Eleanor accomplished something remarkable. She didn't accept society's judgment that she was finished, worthless, past her useful years. She bet on herself when no one else would. Eleanor teaches us that knowledge is power. Her 40 years as a librarian weren't wasted. They gave her research skills, attention to detail, and the patience to look deeper than surface appearances. What others dismissed as just a librarian turned out to be the exact skill set needed to make a historic discovery. Most importantly, Eleanor teaches us that valuable things are often hidden where everyone else stopped looking. The house everyone called a shame was actually a treasure. The unemployed librarian everyone called a burden was actually brilliant. The surface appearance was a lie. The truth required effort to discover. Eleanor's restoration of the house was really a restoration of herself. As she cleaned away grime, she cleared away self-doubt. As she repaired what was broken, she healed what was damaged in her own soul. As she revealed hidden beauty, she revealed her own worth. When Richard and Diane came back, seeking to benefit from her success, Eleanor's response was perfect. Not vindictive revenge, but dignified refusal. She didn't need to punish them. Their own assumptions and short-sightedness had punished them enough. They'd lost access to someone extraordinary because they couldn't see past her circumstances to her character. That's the most elegant revenge there is, proving people so completely wrong that their opinions become meaningless. If you're 60, 70 or older, and someone has told you your best years are behind you, they're wrong. Eleanor's best year came at 61. If you've lost your job and people act like you're disposable, you're not. Your experience and knowledge have value that can't be replaced. If your family has called you a burden, that says more about them than about you. True family recognizes worth. People who can't see your value aren't qualified to judge it. If you have an idea everyone thinks is crazy, maybe you see something they don't. Maybe your research is better than their assumptions. Maybe you're willing to do the work they're too lazy to attempt. Eleanor Morrison saved a house everyone else wanted demolished, but really, she saved herself. She proved that it's never too late to discover hidden treasure. Whether that treasure is manuscripts in a wall or strength in your own soul, the world sees surfaces and calls it sight. But true vision requires looking deeper. The most valuable things are hidden where everyone else was too busy to search. Eleanor kept looking, and she found gold shining in the shadows. Thank you for joining us for Eleanor's incredible journey. Share this story with someone who needs to remember their own worth. And remember, your value isn't determined by others' opinions. It's determined by what you know to be true about yourself. We'll see you in the next story.